So as we said, we're changing it to humility for the crux of what we have with palliative care, but how cultural backgrounds really make a difference for how we take care of people. It's actually one of the domains from the national consensus guidelines on doing this. So our objectives today then are really to identify the steps to culturally sensitive palliative care and recognize how those skills are needed by all clinicians, not providers, but all of us, every one of us that take care of somebody who is seriously ill. And to distinguish some of the features from the Native American culture that can impact that. And trust me, what you're going to learn today will actually improve anyone that you take care of. It shouldn't be specifically to Native Americans because it is so rich with all the things that we have. So why is it important? We need to kind of start from the beginning here. The things that we know with palliative care have to do with comfort, communication, choices, and control. My 4 C's, you've heard me talk about them quite frequently, but that it has to do with decision-making and symptom management, where a person is. And to start with that idea of the sensitivity part of it for their preferences, hopes, and values. How do we get there? My favorite 3 words I use all the time are help me understand. If you ask people and offer it as an open-ended, it'll help so much to get to those different components, because each one of us have unique components from cultural, like for me, and as an elder, just that in itself, from physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and cultural needs, to put them all together. And it really does shape one's experience of wellness, illness, dying, and then the death process, along with those that we are involved with as well. So this is the 6th domain. There are 8 domains from the National Consensus Project from Palliative Care Guidelines. And this came directly from page 38. So this is not my own verbiage, but I really thought it was important for us to understand what are the steps that we really need to do. We need to start off with really assessing and respecting those values, beliefs, and traditions, to really get to the core of where it is, and to truly understand what the person's own understanding is of health and illness. Amazing, we come in and charge in as healthcare professionals with here's the treatment goals and all this, but where are they? Where are they on the whole trajectory of understanding that? And to understand our own biases, both actual and implicit. There are a lot of implicit ones we don't even know we have until we start to explore them a little bit more. So by doing that, then we can start to meet culturally sensitive strategies to incorporate that and utilize and provide those resources, be it written, verbal, bringing in people from the community, whatever those resources are, so that we can actually respectfully acknowledge of and the cultural sensitive support for the people that we take care of and their families. Such a dynamic thing that we need to be able to do. So these were some really great definitions, so we're all on the same page. So I don't usually read from slides, but I really do like this one. In a multicultural world where power imbalances exist, cultural humility is a process of openness, self-awareness, being egoless, I love that one, and incorporating self-reflection and critique after willingly interacting with diverse individuals. The results of achieving cultural humility are mutual empowerment, respect, partnerships, optimal care, and lifelong learning. Wow, I just think that's so powerful. It means so much when we're looking forward for taking care of people. And then the whole idea of the intersections of where we are with races and everything else too. And so it is truly a way of understanding the complexity, the world, the people, and the human events and conditions of social and political life, and the self can seldom be understood as shaped by one factor. They're generally shaped by many factors in diverse and mutually influencing ways. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organizations of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or anything, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. So lots for us to be thinking about. It's not as easy as we think it is. So this is a question I want you all to plant in your head. What is the impact of culturally and linguistically sensitive care? Why do we want this, on physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the people we take care of, our patients, now called clients and customers, etc., and the families and caregivers, so that we know that there are cultural influences, that family and decision-making that we talked about, but pain is another one, the approach to illness, pain and suffering, anguish that goes along with it. And then to really delve into the whole idea of grief, dying, death, and bereavement from those. So we need to have those skills, and none of us are born with it. We actually don't learn it as professionals in our regular practice. We sometimes have to take that extra stuff for that education to make sure that we're not missing those things along the way. So the role of the interdisciplinary team, with all of us, that we need to respect both the patients and families' beliefs, values, and traditional practices. What has worked in the past may still be working. We just need to add some other things to it. So it builds up really unique strengths in those cultural identities. And it becomes a wow factor to me. Every day I learn one more piece of it that just is so exciting for me. So to individualize, again, help me understand those three powerful words. The intersections, as we talked about, of cultural uniqueness. So attend the trainings needed. So again, I applaud you for being here today. This is going to be taped. Please share it with other people to increase our cross-cultural knowledge and empathy and humility when we're taking care of people. We want to totally, though, avoid our own imposing personal values and beliefs and biases. They do pop up. It's interesting how it is, especially when we get asked, so we have to be careful to stay neutral value and to be able to respect those things related to that. Each from a different team perspective, with our own strengths, also within our scope of practice, and sometimes our boundaries that can cross over within that as well. So the interdisciplinary team needs non-judgmental, big one right off the bat. And it's sometimes very hard because there's so many influences that could go along with it right now. We were talking at the beginning of this meeting about COVID and even our own beliefs about, treatment for that and vaccines and social distancing and masks and all of that, with all of that. But to be mindful of those potential biases that are there. That we know that there's conscious of the historic trauma and the awareness of those dynamics that go along with it inherent in people. Well, and Allison will be spending a little bit more time talking about historical trauma. There are also cultural practices, customs, and beliefs that during serious illness that we may not be familiar with or recognize, and that really needs to, as a team, bring it together like, this is what we really need to have. Maybe we need to bring in people from the community that we haven't thought about for part of our plan of care in the past from a palliative perspective. And then preferences for that interaction with the team members and decision-making, be it communal or collective, individual, maybe they have a better relationship with one person or another, and it's not taking it personally, it is truly how we delve into the ability to have good communication with one another. So I get into communication and language, very, very important. How do we, makes me a little uncomfortable when I'm either in the hospital or the nursing home or someplace that I hear somebody being called sweetie or honey or some of these things. Where do they want to be called Ms. or Mrs.? Do they want the pronouns, the gender identity? Often now, when we have the we, they, he, their, she thing, I'll put mom, grandma, Nancy, because that's what people know me as for my own personal identity. But what is the preferred? What do they be called? You know, just because someone else calls them a nickname doesn't necessarily mean you have the privilege or honor to be at that level with them. So very, very important for doing that. And health literacy. Oh my gosh, I can go on and on and on for all the people that I've taken care of, from not understanding medical terminology to understanding what the outcomes and everything that goes along with it, you know, what we're expecting. So that whole trajectory and that level needs to be identified. And it can be from an elder with hearing issues to a person that's not understanding, or just their own grief, going through the grief of not accepting, you know, not believing, you know, angry about it, etc. with that. We all know that verbal and nonverbal are so important, but also the symbolic means of different things that we do. And where are they with cognitive capacity? Are they able to really, you know, engage with what's going on? Or are they only holding on to certain parts of it? We also have to deal with people with learning or developmental disabilities. And so everything can go along with that. I will give the example of sitting with somebody that it was acknowledging during a conversation with a provider that did a fantastic job explaining something. And they turned to me and said, what did they say? So was it they really didn't understand, or they thought I was going to translate it for them? Or, you know, I had no idea. So it was a real hard one for me to truly go through. And definitely developmental stages across the lifespan. In palliative world, and even in the hospice world, we take care of children. And those are the different perspectives that we need to consider. For those with non-English medical, it is important to truly use medical interpreters or bilingual clinicians that are there, so that the diversity is more incorporate. However, please make sure to share with them what the conversation is going to be about. I was working with a family of Chinese descent and going in to talk about code status and DNR. And we found one of our bilingual clinicians that was going to be able to come in. And I had already had a good relationship with this family. They trusted me, etc. And I started to bring up the conversation, and the interpreter broke out into tears. I'm going, oh my gosh, because of their own, where they were with the whole thing. So it's very important to prepare whoever you're talking to what the conversation is going to be about, so that they're ready to have that go on. So we do not want family members placed in the role of interpreter. They might become brokerage with some of the things that are going with some of that. They might not share it exactly the same way that we want them to say it, protecting the family, etc. So having those conversations is very important, and how we do that, because some of it, not only the non-medical, but from communication, sometimes it needs to go through somebody, not directly, even though it's the patient that still makes the decisions. So how do they prefer the way of receiving materials and information that goes along with it? So we do want to incorporate those representatives in the plan of care, so that we incorporate that, especially for non-English, or if there's capacity issues, that for sure that their healthcare agent or a guardian or whoever is the representative is there with that plan of care when we're talking about these people with serious illness and where they're going. We know just the whole idea of culture from a rural, frontier, and underserved population is enormous. From limited resources, the whole disadvantage from diverse populations, how to get communication there, how to get supplies there. We don't want people left behind. That community capacity is such an important thing for us to explore, you know, with resources. And it's amazing how many people, because it's such a network that's there within each community, such as community health workers and representatives and other people within there that can be very, very important to be explored. There's also the importance for comprehensive in-person assessment needs. Nowadays, hopefully we're having more virtual if the person's not able to do it from a different place, but you know, somehow to do that. And definitely advanced care planning, you know, preparing the person for what may be ahead with their goals of care in a way that's understood by them, not necessarily from us. And it's amazing so many times I go in with my own agenda and it changes, quickly, because this is what's more priority for them at any given time. So, sometimes we have to do it in little bits and pieces as we go forward. When we're doing for the people that are underserved, as I mentioned, telehealth approach, telephonics is working nowadays, and then double back with teach back with what's the information shared. We have things like weekly nurse coaching sessions. So it becomes routinely for a person, just even for the communication, to help with loneliness, etc. And then intensive training that we want for symptom management, for problem solving, decision making support that goes along the way. So the coordination that goes along and the connecting with the families as well too. Who is their family or their connected person at any given time? And then prompt clinical visits versus trying to call 911. And so any kind of clinical visit we can do to prevent that 911 and being admitted to the hospital if that's not something that they wanted or needs at that time. Definitely with the LGBTQIAs, the gender expression, I really liked this idea that a way an individual expresses or presents themselves to others, an internal sense of masculinity or femininity can be there. And then their whole identity, one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both or neither, how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. One's gender identity can be the same or different from where they were assigned at birth. So again, that whole orientation needs to be recognized and have them work through how it means and how it impacts them during palliative care and serious illness. And then definitely the child. We often think of elders, but if the cultural dynamics is the child, even for a child whose parent is dying, but whole idea of where's the role of the child, how that culture defines them, and how parents share the information with the child. It's amazing how much children are either further ahead or have better understanding than what the parents may think they do as they're protecting them. It's so interesting to watch that in my years of pediatric palliative care. So helping parents to define what's being a quote good parent is such a hard thing because they feel that they're the loss of control, their loss of being able to protect their child from what they're going through with serious illness and pain and all those different anguish things that go along with it. And how do we make medical decision making? Where is the child involved? If they're a very young child to an elder child. I remember watching a 2020 Vision series not too long ago, and a woman came on and talked about how she and her, I think it was a 10-year-old boy, were watching on organ donation, and the little boy said, if anything ever happened to me, that's what I want happen. And 2 weeks later, he died suddenly in a car accident. And the mother had never even thought about such a thing. But now that she had that gift of what the boy had said, she did say, that she did want to do that. And that child was able to help 37 other individuals. It was amazing to see that. There's also serious illness with in utero, pregnancy, childbirth. They're more usually catastrophic than things that, where we have a little bit more time, but we still want to be very aware of that and moving forward with that. So these are some of the big dynamic elements I want you to be able to take away from a cultural aspect. And from this point, then I'd like to turn it over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Great overview. I just want us to be aware that there are Indigenous Americans all around us, and oftentimes we're not included in medical studies or data, et cetera. So be mindful that as an overview, there are 9.7 million Indigenous folks in our country, making up nearly 3% of the population. And so that awareness really helps to bring us inclusivity. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak and share with you, because there's not a whole lot of us in the space. There are 574 recognized tribes, including over 200 in Alaska, and over 300 American Indian reservations. So the terms American Indian and Alaska Native can be a little bit confusing. American Indian is the politically recognized, federally recognized term, and oftentimes anthropologically or culturally we'll choose to call ourselves or be called by others Native American, but they're interchangeably. The term Alaska Native is very specific to Indigenous peoples of Alaska, and those are Inuit, Athabascan, or Inuit and American Indian populations. So if that's not confusing enough, you can understand why we do have some challenges in understanding different aspects of culture and history that influence palliative care and other care. So we'll review some of our history today just to gain perspective and insight that will better help us in caring for ourselves and patients. So the next slide is an illustration of how over time, well, I'm sorry you can't see that, but over time, this GIF should play so that you can see that there's a shrinking amount of American soils. So if we had time to share at the end, I might be able to share my screen for that. So what I mean is that our country used to be solely indigenously populated, and now we're on reservations that are very small pockets of land that, and we've transitioned in that way because of a breach of treaties or other complex phenomenon. And we'll talk about the results of that. Next slide, Nancy. Thanks so much. So we're independent governments. What that means is we have a relationship with our United States government that allows us to have our own constitutions that are similar to what our US Constitution was based upon, but we also have individual relationships. So this is important to understand. The next slide about how some of us have become more of an amalgamation of more dominant or colonial cultures. And some of us maybe identify as more indigenous in our cultural process. So if we're acculturated, that means that we're perhaps borrowing some basic habits, attitudes, and models of life that we've been influenced by from the colonial influences, and that to be assimilated means that we become a part of that larger culture. And that's really what was systematically enforced upon us through unequal laws and rules that actually made it illegal to practice as an Indigenous person or to be an Indigenous person speaking our traditional languages. Nonetheless, we're still here and doing the work. You can see some wonderful photos of my mother, Ewastepikte, dumplings is her nickname, living her traditional lifestyle, and then later having her first Holy Communion and transitioning to boarding school. So this process of assimilation has really happened within my lifetime, and different individuals have different stories. Some of us went to boarding school, maybe some of us didn't. Some of us have worked very hard and been blessed to have retained our cultural knowledge, and others may be expressing more of the more mainstream American culture. So just be aware of those, that variety and variation. Next slide, please, Nancy. And looking at our values, it's hard to generalize American Indian cultures into one because there are so many of us with different practices, but in general, we value family, elders and children have high status, and then Our ideals are respect, gratitude, humility, generosity, and humor. Next slide. We also practice particular ceremonies. This is a blanket ceremony that was practiced at my medical school at the University of Washington School of Medicine. You see my auntie is gifting me, and auntie's sang a honor song at that time. You also see some of our medicine plants who we consider relatives and brothers and sisters to share the blessings of this existence with. And so sweetgrass brings in positivity, whereas sage is dispelling negativity, but really also is a fumigant as an antibacterial and antiviral. So there's multiple different reasons that we practice our traditional ways. And oftentimes our ceremonies have giveaways or sharing that are incorporated into them. There are social and specific ceremonies, maybe for adoption and birthing, but also regional and tribal ceremonies, such as sun dance, or in my culture, we have the stick dance memorial potlatch that are associated with a lot of gifting. And next slide, please. So there are linguistic aspects to caring for individuals within palliation. We each have our own understanding and constructs of language and interpretation. Maybe the individuals we're caring for don't speak English as a first language. That's always interesting to discover. It turns out that my mom's first language was Athabascan, and I only learned that because she told me a story of being fed muskrat, and she said "Adzaki gaga," because she spoke our first language primarily. So within stories, we learn about our culture, we learn about our songs, and learned ceremonies. These things are not often written down. Folks around here, from what I understand, and I thank Dila Bohine for sharing this in a CHAD educational opportunity that recently, where she shared that folks around here are monotheistic. That is, that tribes particularly believe in spirit and practice ceremony, but also honor all stages of life, as you'll see in the next slide, where we really believe that balance occurs from the presence of folks who are in all stages of life being involved and vigorous and enjoying that balance with that kind of representation. So that's important when caring for Indigenous folks, that we involve all generations and consider involving the family as much as possible, or per the wishes of that individual, of course. Next slide, please. And looking here at our population in North Dakota and South Dakota, are the top 10% of American Indians. So there are certain states that have a higher percentage of American Indians, and that includes our states of North and South Dakota, with up to about 110,000 individuals and many different tribes. Next slide. And those North Dakota tribes include Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, 3 affiliated tribes, the MHA or Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, Spirit Lake Nation, and Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate Nation. You'll also see on a future slide that it includes Trenton Indian Service Area, and that cares for Turtle Mountain members. Next slide. So you see that Trenton Indian Service Area on the left, a little triangle there, as well as our other reservations, all caring for distinct tribes and tribal members, but through marriage and modernization, it's not all people on the reservation are always of a particular tribe. So that's just another complexity to be aware of, that we do move and marry. But also you'll see Fort Berthold Reservation. That's where the MHA Nation, 3 affiliated tribes, are located. Next slide. So you see that MHA Nation, Mandan, Hidatsa, Rikara Nation there on Fort Berthold. So that's important for me because I didn't grow up on a reservation. We don't have reservation systems in Alaska. And so to me, it was important to distinguish, oh, nations have different names than reservations sometimes, et cetera, et cetera. So next slide, please. And South Dakota tribe overview, Standing Rock, Cheyenne, Sisseton, Wahpeton, Wayate, and then Flandreau, Santee Sioux tribes, as well as Yankton, Crow Creek, Lower Brule, Rosebud Sioux tribe, and the Oglala Lakota tribe. I did include this link to the Oglala Lakota Nation, honoring that there is a trend towards not utilizing Sioux necessarily, though we have been named and are referred to as Sioux people, or often as peoples who were named by other peoples. So Sioux is a term by their historic enemies, and they prefer to generally, so the Oglala Lakota Nation goes by Oglala Lakota tribe, though you'll see on many federal documents and official documents, they're the Oglala Sioux. So that's a mouthful, but what it does is teaches us that sovereignty and the process of sovereignty and discovering that within Indigenous America is a live process that's happening, as we speak. Next slide. And those illustrate those tribal lands there. And next slide, Nancy. So how about historical trauma and what is its definition? It's thought to be the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma, which of course was experienced not only from displacement, but also disease, and sometimes even things like smallpox blankets being disseminated amongst our population. So sometimes untrustworthy behavior. And the historical trauma response further is a constellation of features in reaction to this trauma, including, but not limited to, depression, self-destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts and gestures, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and difficulty recognizing and expressing emotions. Next slide. So just to give a sense there, some photographs from my family reminding us that we lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle off the land and then later settled in the tiny village you see from the photograph, the perspective from the air, where we have a community of 200 people. But 2 generations ago, that village didn't really exist. And so we've transitioned a lot to the modern economy, to being organized into corporations, and also to completely different clothing and power structures that are around us, as well as just the physical structures of our homes and expectations, not to mention language, etc. So we're always learning and adapting to our environments. And just a reminder that all of us are survivors from a line from somewhere. And so as Indigenous Americans, we're just really close to that line and that experience. All right, next slide. So there was a wonderful project looking at care for our elders from the Lakota perspective. So this is a partnership between palliative care physicians, researchers at South Dakota State University, and also the community of Oglala Lakota elders and other stakeholders. And you can see a picture of my aunties and myself at our stick dance memorial ceremony that we've been blessed to practice since 1978, when our religious practices were again legalized, so we could practice our memorial ceremony. And we really syncretize our Catholic beliefs. We have prayers with the priests there at our halls up in Alaska. Okay, next slide. So out of that collaboration, the Care for Our Elders project, we became aware that there's a preference to speak to elders, but also to familiarize yourself in practices such as this. So perhaps reading or exposing ourselves to knowledge about Indigenous Americans, and then speaking in person to a leader within those cultures. These studies were specific to Alzheimer's, just as an FYI. And when delivering difficult news, it's important to be mindful of the family being present and the importance of avoiding some of those more distinctive words, such as death or dying. And we have a slide on that coming up. It's culturally appropriate to ask for prayers, and we generally accept referring to the creator as appropriate as our more inclusive term and respectful term, and that questions are encouraged to be asked by providers, but we might pause or longer than is comfortable for some of us to allow that space to be filled by communication. We tend to have longer pauses in our talk, in our dialogue in Indigenous America. Also, that facilitating is often the role of providers. So we're not always providing direct care and prescriptions. Sometimes we're calling family members or community members to help facilitate the care that may be needed. Next slide. So other things, severe illness can be mentioned or could be life-threatening. These are kinds of terms that sometimes I can use rather than a more definitive death or dying. The big picture here is that what we keep in our field of energy and consciousness as Indigenous people is thought to possibly manifest. And so we don't want to perseverate on the negative. Rather, we are aware that the risks of the disease could include very severe illness that could be life-threatening. It's not as direct as it typically is in more conventional dialogue in America. So we can be indirect and still understand what that means. I hope that makes sense. So some other thoughts: community resources, preferences related to physical contact. If a procedure requires cutting of hair, it's important to be aware there may be a ceremony or a particular way that that needs to happen. Speaking to people's level of literacy, and then understanding that they may have their own perceptions, such as diabetes comes from the clinic, I shouldn't have come here, and that you might have to deal with understanding there's different perspectives and have a dialogue and really create a genuine relationship around that. So there can be different levels of acculturation and different levels of access to traditional healing. So as a provider that's been in a community for a long time, you may be aware of a traditional healer, whereas a younger patient who's not as connected to the community that comes and sees you might not be aware of that provider. So just be aware of those types of dynamics. Also, others may have different concepts about pain and suffering, which is particularly relevant to palliation. So what are they comfortable with? And what does it really mean to them to not be suffering? Perhaps they're able to go to a ceremony, even though it could cause hardship or an exacerbation of their disease. Next slide. What Andrew Jimmy from my tribe says is our goal should be to help elders living out their lives in comfort, not taking medicines they don't need to, and not living where they don't want to. And doesn't that sound consistent with our whole dialogue here? So the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium has done a lot to become aware and advocate for relevant palliation. And I thank you for reaching out to my colleagues in Alaska previously, Nancy, for collaborating on projects. Next slide. Further, that there is a palliative care program on Native American, or that we should aim for relevant palliative care programs on reservations. And Nancy has shared a guidelines booklet, which we can be aware of. If you have time, Nancy, to to chat that in, feel free. As a summary, RNs who provide hands-on care should be available, and social workers could also serve as translators for those in native languages. Also, advocates from the community can help patients complete advanced directives, such as community health representatives. So we have a wonderful community health aid program in Alaska, and that's just such a tremendously successful and useful program. So I'm just going to chat in a link to their guidelines and their model. But such a valuable resource. If we have community members who are interested in delivering care, why not enlist them to do this really important work? Also dietitians, and including someone such as a medicine person who can offer spiritual support, and also those important ceremonies and rites of passage for persons as they transition to the other world. Next slide. Okay, so just some visual reminders that all four directions have our four cardinal colors from this part of the Great Plains. But if you look at our medicine staff from my tribe, Athabascan, on the right, you'll see that we have very similar colors. So it's just helpful to realize that whether it's all four directions or the upper, the middle, and the lower kingdoms, we have so much in common and a shared history, though each distinct. And I love that ribbon skirts also express that individualism. Though they're all ribbon skirts, they have a different pattern and each one is unique. Okay, next slide. And next slide. That is a photo honoring Howard Luke, who's one of my revered elders who did a lot of leadership in tribal sovereignty and maintaining traditional concepts in our tribal settings, in our corporate settings. And here's our case. So I'm happy to hear folks chime in. Please feel free to have dialogue. So the setting is here in the Dakotas, a 96-year-old female with a past medical history of type 2 diabetes that's well controlled, hypertension, cataracts, and hearing loss, osteoarthritis of bilateral hips and bilateral knees, presents via phone call. So her daughter, who is her legal representative, reports that she's probably just stressed out because her brother just passed away, and the funeral is today, but she's been running out of her medications. And her mom just says that she's been feeling bum, and I can hear them talking Indian in the background. That's what my family would say. So intermittently, the daughter will come off the phone and then I'll hear them have a dialogue in their first language, and then she'll report back to me she's feeling bum after 3 long sentences. So, so that's the case. And I wanted to also honor, before we transition to this next slide, that there is a Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, and I have their link there. And grandmother Rita Long, Visitor Holy Dance, is a representative from the Lakota people who's been honored to be in that global Indigenous leadership group. So just to be aware, there are Indigenous grandmothers being honored and organized globally. And so with that, in our 96-year-old individual, next slide. Now you find out that she, in fact, is run out of Ambien, and we figure is probably having some withdrawal. There's been lots of snowstorms, and they have a lack of transportation. And next slide. So what should we plan to do? Any particular ideas? Maybe we can get a look at her. So next, please. So I opt, since I'm there for ceremony, I'm called in to ensure that she's stable, checking her blood pressure, ensure there's that she's moving all her extremities, that she has symmetrical strength and facies, etc. Check and make sure she's eating and other functions are working, and just share a story a little bit and check in on her. Next, her vitals are looking stable. She's a bit on the thin side. Her dentition is poor. Next slide. So she forgot to get her medicine. So that's an example of this indirect, she's not going to blame anybody or be funny or mean to someone and say it's their fault or it's the weather's fault or anything. She's just going to say, you know, I just wasn't able to, I forgot it. But really, if I talk more, then we can figure out she doesn't have reliable transportation, the truck's broken down, and plus there's all of these storms as of late. So in that she didn't plan ahead, now she still can't access them because of the limitations. So next slide. We eventually got someone to facilitate delivering the medication by the next day. And also enlisted her family, more than one person to help with reliability, and enlisted a team of folks to help remind for important medications. And we talked about the possibilities of diminishing or thinking of alternatives to Ambien if necessary. So that's just another thought, since it is quite psychoactive. Next. So her most important priority is being able to attend ceremonies, especially those that honor those that have departed. And in this case, she was able to attend future ceremonies. So I was able to attend this particular funeral and then come back and visit with her and share a story with her. And she was able to make it to future ceremonies. Next slide. And another complication is that there are several generations in her home, and that just creates an element that we would have to be in true relationship with the family to figure out, which is that her daughter has substance abuse, particularly with alcoholism. And so I'm just mindful when medications run out early to really be aware, are they running out? Is anybody taking them? Or what else is exactly going on with that phenomenon, and how could we use lesser risk medications? So those are all important dialogue to have. That just takes time. Next slide. And counsels them regarding the possibility of a lockbox and having an extremely responsible family member to help her with that nighttime regimen. The other piece that is key here is those community health aides and representatives who actually know what's going on in the community. Otherwise, I might not have known that her daughter had substance abuse for real, right? So it's what the family tells me often. So they might share more freely because they share our concerns. All right, so she was able to participate and was able to pass on at home, surrounded by key family members at the age of 99 last winter. So bless her soul. And next slide there. So this is an example of how we sometimes live in Alaska. That's the cabin that my parents raised us in seasonally, about 10 miles out of town. So just being aware that palliation or healthcare in general might need to be delivered to a variety of settings, such as even this. And how do we, when delivering that healthcare, do so in a respectful and efficient and effective manner? All right, so Juliana and Abasi, Wopila, thank
utilizing things within our resources, within a community, the community capacities. Especially now, with COVID right now, our workforce is dwindling. How can we expand it? How can we utilize, people within the community? And when we look at Indigenous populations, they do that all the time. Like you said, how many generations are within a household? But then you also have to do the protection, like you said, the lockbox and some of the other things you have to take into perspective as well, too.
Yeah, and so you might be visiting with a family, but not know there's a little one around sometimes, right? So keeping in mind, your grandkids come over, so right. And how can we keep things in access, addressing cultural bias in the healthcare setting with direct care providers? I think awareness around bias testing. So, really, it's good to know where your strengths and weaknesses are. And I really do think that there's some good resources for online bias testing. And I think that should be a systematic.
What do providers need to do in order to build trust with Indigenous patients who might not trust them?
So I'm working on a project right now that incorporates the concept of a triangle of trust when working with minority communities, and we plan to expand it to the circle of trust. So triangle of trust, provider, researcher in this setting, provider, patient, and trusted individual. Okay. So basically just involving a trusted individual and in Indigenous America involving the community. So knowing, oh, so-and-so, I know so-and-so, that's why we're always connecting by who we know. Are you related to so-and-so? Or maybe talking about just something. So gaining respect by talking about things that we have in common. And then referring to or knowing things about their culture or their tribe. So maybe there's a chairman or a leader or someone that we can also refer to, say, oh, I know the tribe is promoting awareness of diabetes prevention. Does that make sense? So you kind of have to know about the tribe, but you have to know the tribe itself or members of the tribe, so it's all